My name is Aaron Holliday, and I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing some of the most prolific and pioneering investors of our generation today, Fred Wilson and Joanne Wilson. Before we get into that, I think it's really important to take a moment to think about the topic. So the topic is investors who spark a movement. And if we think about this and think about what Andrea and Denmark West are doing with this event, in 10 years from now, we're going to see that this is a moment in time where a movement is being sparked. A moment in time where there's a rise of African-American VCs who are beginning to unlock and access capital. And so this is monumental. And so before we bring up Joanne and Fred, I just want to thank Andrea and Denmark West and the Culture Shift team for really organizing this and putting this together. And so let's welcome Joanne and Fred to the stage. Yep. For those of you who may not know Joanne and Fred, as I mentioned, they're two of the most prolific investors of our time. Fred Wilson is the founder of Union Square Ventures. Union Square Ventures is a New York-based venture capital firm that has backed companies like Twitter and MongoDB. Joanne Wilson is an angel investor and has been one of the most vocal and probably the first angel investor to talk about investing in female founders. So Fred and Joanne, this is really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you on this stage together talking about this topic. And we would like to just thank you so much for being here.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah. Whoa.
Now,
I was instructed to speak closely into the mic.
all right.
I think I overdid it.
So, it's very rare that both of you appear on the same stage at the same time. So talk to us about what was it about this decision or this venue that brought you together here?
Well, I think this is the first time we've ever done this in like a public forum. We did it for someone's class once. But, I think that both Fred and I are very passionate about putting money into founders that are not the typical founders that get funded. And I know that we have done a lot of things not only in our personal life in regards to funding, but also in our nonprofit life and trying to make a difference. And so to be in front of a brand new generation of VCs that are committed to underserved communities that might have come from one themselves, I think was very inspiring.
Yeah, I think it's not just the entrepreneurs, but it's really the investor community. Because if you don't have investors who are open-minded to different kinds of entrepreneurs, then you're not going to get different kinds of entrepreneurs. So, or they're not going to get funded, right? So, really, it's people such as yourself that I think are the most important leader. Like that has to happen in some ways before diverse entrepreneurs can get their due.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, agreed.
And Joanne, you've been doing this for a really long time, and you were probably one of the first angel investors to take a stance to talk about, making sure there's access to capital for female entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing as Fred was saying. It's like when I started doing angel investing, I was hearing from all these women, and I understood their businesses, or they had some funding, and the only people that they were getting money from was white men. And I wanted to change that because A, I understood their businesses, and B is there is something comforting about someone who's sort of in your camp, who's your consigliere, who understands what you're talking about, and can be there as an outside partner that's not in it 24/7. And I've made the same commitment to minorities as well. It's like for the next generation of people coming up, you can't be it if you can't see it. And so I felt that, as we all know the statistics, most of the people on the other side of the table are white men. And so that's why I made a decision to make women a priority.
So over the last several years, we've been seeing the rise and success of several female founders. You have Katrina Lake, who took Stitch Fix public. Talk to us about the groundwork that has to be laid to continue to see outcomes like that.
I think the groundwork has been laid. I mean, I've invested in over 75 women. You've invested in a bunch of women. And we all know that these companies don't happen overnight. They take a long time. And so I really believe that some of the seeds that were laid 8 to 10 years ago we're going to see in the next couple of years more women have publicly traded companies, more women have really great exits. And, I've said this before, the importance of all of those women staying in the public eye instead of going home, which women tend to do, is extremely important for the next generation of people coming up the line.
The thing that is challenging if you're an early stage investor, certainly if you're an angel, and I think also in seed, is that if you stake out this new territory and say, we're going to go after underrepresented founders, whether it's women or whether it's minorities or whatever, then you got to get the more institutional part of the market
the big money
to want to do that as well, right? Because you can't get these companies all the way by yourself. And I've watched Joanne, she's been doing this for 10 years, and I've watched her just, like literally bang her head against the desk saying, I can't get these VCs to fund this founder, and it's just because they don't understand it, and it's very frustrating. So that's the thing that has to happen. The good news, I think, is that a lot of the venture firms want to do it. They don't necessarily know how to do it, and so that's where the two of you and people like you come in. You got to hold their hands. You got to call them up, and you got to say, this is the best company in my portfolio. Trust me on that. Take the meeting. Take a strong look at this. And then because I do think people in the venture community look at their portfolios and they're not proud of what's in, at least, the optics of that portfolio, right? So they want to change, but it's not easy to change the behavior that's existed since the beginning of time in the venture business, right? So they need help.
Yeah, so this is interesting. When Nnamdi and I were out raising capital, one institutional LP said that a lot of VCs underestimate the risk at Series A, whereas founders, particularly women and minority founders, feel like they have to have all of the underlying unit economics strong. It has to be growing very rapidly to get to a Series A or a growth round. Fred, you invest at the Series A and Series B. What does it take for someone to see the potential in a female or minority founder, and to take the risk that you might take on a company that's not founded by a woman or a diverse founder to get to Series A or B?
I think your argument is that people who are underrepresented, founders who are underrepresented in the business have to have more to show for their companies than people who, look the part.
Right.
I think that's true.
I do too.
And so what that means actually is it's actually lower risk to invest in underrepresented founders because they implicitly have to have more to show, right? So that's a good argument. But the other thing I think is, as Joanne mentioned, she understands their businesses. It's also true, particularly with women, I think. I don't know if this is true as much with minority founders, but it might be, is that women tend to start businesses that are in slightly different sectors than men do. And so if you're a male investor, you just might not understand that business as well. Your partner just talked about an apparel business, right? Joanne started her business in the apparel industry. She understands the apparel business. Like, there's nobody, I don't think there's an investor out there that understands the apparel business than her, right? So she's well suited to invest in that.
Makes sense. What's interesting about this time right now, there's a rise of female GPs as well as a rise of diverse GPs. Fred, you actually, your team brought on Rebecca Caden as a GP. And one thing people may not know about USV is that they've always had women and underrepresented minorities on their team, in their junior team. I remember when I was coming out of business school looking at the top VCs, I saw Brian as an investor in your, on your team. So you've always seemed to recognize it's important to have a diverse team. Internally at 645, we call this period the representation phase, right? So we're starting to get more representation of diverse GPs as well as gender diverse GPs. And this is an important phase. The next important phase is what we call the performance phase. So the performance phase is, can we get more women GPs and diverse GPs to get into deals that go public and are acquired for very large sums of money? And as we start to unpack this internally and whiteboard it, we discovered that in this particular industry, performance and inclusion are inextricably linked because VCs share deals with each other. So my question, Fred, for you is, how do we work together? How does a GP, a female GP out there, or a diverse GP, I saw my friend Marlon in the back out there, cross-culture, they do great deals. How do we work more collaboratively with firms like USV?
You know, I agree with you that the venture capital business is a little bit of a closed network and that people tend to share deals with the same people again and again. But the thing that's actually changed a lot is that the entrepreneurs are ultimately controlling who gets into a round. So if we decide to lead a round, well, what we typically talk to the entrepreneur is, okay, we're going to do 3 of the 5. Who's the other 2? And if they said, you guys, we'd be like, great, awesome, right? So I actually don't think that the work that people who are trying to get into the hot deals need to do is necessarily cozying up to the VC. I think they need to convince the entrepreneur why they need to be in the syndicate. And there, I think you have a very, very strong argument. You know, Rebecca, who joined us a year ago, has gotten into a bunch of deals because she's at a well-known firm and she's a woman. And I don't mean to denigrate that at all. I just have seen it.
It's like Rebecca had a great track record.
Right, but I've seen it where she goes to the entrepreneur and she says, you know, you want me on your board, don't you? And the entrepreneur's like, yeah, I want you on my board, right? They want you on our board because she's smart, because she's at a good firm, and also because there's not enough women on her board or his board. And so that's actually an advantage. You have that advantage too. So I think that the work has to be with the entrepreneurs, just getting them to know about you and know that you're ready and willing to write a check. And then when the deal comes together, I think you have a better chance of getting in than most people.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, years ago, a decade ago, Fred's been in the venture world for 30 some odd years. There was more sharing going on between VC firms. Now it's become insanely competitive. And so, I even tell founders that go out there that are raising their Series A, you get a term sheet. When you go to the next VC, don't tell them where your term sheet came from. Just say, hey, I want you to know someone's doing diligence, I got a term sheet, you go to the next one. And so it really is all on the founder to play the game and figure out who wants to be in their business. I don't think there's as much sharing with the VCs as there used to be.
And I think it's incumbent on the founders to not let that happen to them, right? Don't let Union Square Ventures show up and say, here's 3 of 5, and by the way, we'd like you to give the other 2 to this other firm that looks just like us. Founders should say, we got you, got what you're going to get us. Now we're going to go give the other 2 to people who are going to give us other things, whether it's relationships, knowledge, access, whatever. So the founders have to do that. They have to say, it's my cap table, it's my round, it's my company. I'm going to pick who's coming into this deal.
Makes sense. So, diversity and inclusion and performance is always a hot topic. In your household, where are some of the areas you might disagree around performance of, female or diverse founders and their ability to access capital?
I don't think we disagree on much.
We disagree about what is the ideal temperature in the apartment.
Exactly.
Okay? Joanne would prefer it to be 68. I prefer it to be 78.
Yeah, that's definitely a contentious thing. I usually win, but yes, I appreciate the heat.
I wear a lot of sweaters.
But I think in general, we've always been champions of the underdogs. And I think that has been obvious in the way that we've approached our lives and what we've taught our children and how we've approached our investing.
Makes sense. All right, so I want to go a level deeper, if that's okay. I know
Sure.
you're not afraid.
Go
Joanne.
ahead.
I know you don't play. So in the 1960s, my mother-in-law grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and she marched with Dr. Martin Luther King as a young girl, teenage girl. And during that time, she was sprayed by fire hoses, she was thrown in jail, dogs were sicked on her. It was quite a traumatic experience.
I'm sure.
And when you ask her about that time, she tells us that the media was a catalyst for change in the civil rights movement. So for the first time on national television, and television was a new technology at the time, relatively new, people were able to see domestic terrorism happening on African Americans. Now, if we fast forward to today, and we think about social media is playing a major role in a number of movements that are happening today. Everything from the Me Too movement to institutionalized racism in our police departments. My question is, and being an investor in Twitter, knowing the founders of Twitter, what role does social media and the media play in movements of our time? And how is the media and social media potentially impeding some of the movements that are getting started in our time?
I mean, Fred can talk to the Twitter, but in general, I'm not so sure it's just, the new zeitgeist of what is today. And it's just part of evolution. I think the wonderful thing about social media is that we can all be our own social media. And so we're allowed to see things that we would necessarily see. And then we have a better idea of like, wow, whoa, this is happening in this community. This is not okay. And so, we were talking about this last night. It's like you go back to Rodney King. I mean, it wasn't the first, but it was broadcast live on TV, and everyone was like, oh my God. And so I do think that the power of social media is the power of the person.
I agree with that. It's a way for people who don't have power to impact somebody who does. And I'll tell you a little story about this. So, CEO of one of our companies sent me an email a couple weeks ago, and he said, we did an all hands on Friday, and a bunch of my employees want to know if the Saudi royal family is an investor in our company through USV. And I said to him, they are not. But it was the first time that I'd ever gotten that question, and I realized that a lot of employees who work in our portfolio don't know who they work for. So I wrote a blog post about this, and I said something like, bad rulers in the Gulf, and people who poison our environment, polluters, and fill our bodies with opioids or whatever. Like we venture capitalists shouldn't be managing money for that. Some young entrepreneur from the Gulf wrote a blog post on on Medium, and then tweeted at me, and he said, Fred, don't throw all of us in the Gulf under the bus. And I read his blog post, and I read my blog post, and I didn't necessarily throw everybody in the Gulf under the bus, but I am now sensitized to an issue that I wasn't as sensitized to before, which is that you can never make blanket statements about any group of people, right? No matter who you are, right? And so I think it's actually it's a very powerful thing, social media. And yes, there are bad people using social media to do bad things, and that is a problem. But I still think ultimately it's actually doing more good, at least in my world, than bad.
Yeah. I mean, look at these crazy lunatics that are being, going after people, and they're total racists. And the next day, their companies are like, you're done. Yeah. And that's fantastic. And I actually think in terms of like the voter suppression, it's going to be up to these large companies to say, we're not going to do business in this state anymore. And so that's coming really from social media and conversations as nasty as they get on social media or Twitter or other areas. And certainly there's a lot of fake stuff going on and angry voices that need to be monitored. But at the end of the day, I always believe the good outweighs the bad.
Let's unpack that a little more. So with social media, it's pretty much direct-to-consumer content.
Yeah.
Right, direct-to-consumer media. Now, historically, there was the press, and there's rules and regulations around the press. Can you talk to us about the difference between social media and the press, and should there be regulation to control social media?
Well, I think a lot of the rules and regulations around the press, the traditional press, were actually self-imposed, right? We need to get, like, when I was growing up in the business, and I did, like, PR training, what people would tell me is that journalists needed, if they got a tip, they needed to substantiate that tip with two more sources, or they couldn't write it. I don't think that's a law. I think that's just the norm of the big newsrooms. They're just not going to let a journalist print something. And there's that great movie about Watergate where Ben Bradley was like, we got to get a second source here. We can't run this without a second source, you know. So I think it isn't that the government necessarily regulated media, it's that media self-regulated itself. And I think that that's what has to happen. Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and other social platforms, YouTube, they got to regulate themselves. They're trying. They really are trying.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a whole new set of things that they got to be watching out for that they honestly weren't watching out for, and they got, caught.
Yeah, so Fred, I want to kind of go back maybe about 20 years in the 90s when you started Flatiron and saw the movement of the internet and how that movement can change new company formation. The internet bubble bust, that may have had an impact on Flatiron, and then you did it again, right? You went back and started USV. What went into that decision to try it again? And Joanne, what advice did you have for Fred during that time when he was starting a venture capital firm all over again after the bubble?
It was an interesting time, that bubble, because everyone in the first generation of the web who built companies, the majority of them just saw that this was an opportunity, but they didn't grow up with technology. And so they really weren't building companies necessarily, as we saw them all went down the drain, of how you integrate technology into your life. And, it was a massive bust for us to close down Flatiron, took off some time. But I always thought he'd go back into that world. I just think you had to go back with the right partners again, with the right thesis. And we were watching the next generation of the web. And I think it was a lot more interesting as the second generation, as the people that built those companies grew up with computers. And so they built businesses. They really did understand technology innately because it was part of their daily lives.
Yeah, I mean, I had also spent 10 years working at another venture firm. So
Right.
I spent from 86 to 96, 95 really working at a venture capital firm, and then from 96 to 2001 with Flatiron. And so, by then I was 15 years into the business. I really didn't think about doing anything else. I mean, I was pretty certain that I would start another firm. I just honestly have always thought of myself as a venture capitalist. That's why I call my blog ABC, like a venture capitalist. Like that's what I am, and I've tried to reinvent myself. Joanne somehow can reinvent herself. She's literally been 20 different things, and I'm just one thing.
All right, so before we take questions from the audience, I want to do something fun. I want to do a rapid fire round of questions. So try
Now, do
your...
we both have to answer them, or does she can just
Both?
answer them?
No, they will be directed. They will be directed. Here's the rules. Now, try your best to have one word answer.
That's
Your
tough.
best. All right, so let's start with you, Fred. What is Joanne's superpower?
Cheerleading.
Joanne, what is Fred's kryptonite?
Can I use more than one word? Defining the obvious.
All right, Fred, most overhyped investment category right now.
Crypto.
Consumer products.
Consumer products?
Yeah.
Yep. Joanne, most, underestimated category.
Me?
Both of you, yep.
Crypto.
Retail.
Retail, all right. Fred, long or short Ethereum? I'm not sure if you can answer that.
Long.
All right. Long or short Ethereum?
Oh, long.
We own
Long.
it. We own it together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're very long.
All right, great. Will it ever be illegal to have a driver's license and drive a car?
No. But I don't think people will be driving cars.
I think yes, but I don't know. Like, I think it could be 50 years before that happens.
Yep. And last question, will you see gender parity and racial parity in a VC industry in your lifetime?
God, I hope so.
I'm more optimistic, sadly, about gender parity than I am about racial parity, just because I see a lot more of it happening. I definitely think that we will see about half of the investment professionals in the venture business be women or people who identify as women in the next 20 years.
Me too.
I hope that we can see that with racial diversity too, but I think that may take longer.
All right, and I think in the audience, many of you may have cards and pens. Feel free to write down those questions and send them up, or just, I guess, maybe wave for the mic. And at this point, we'll take some questions from the audience.
Do you? I know you mentioned earlier about the competition in the VC space. Do you think too much capital has flowed into the VC space at this point in time?
Yeah.
And how do you think that will resolve itself?
Fred can speak to that too, but, I sit in a very interesting position where I pretty much talk to most of the VCs across the country. I think that it will resolve itself because not everything that you invest in goes up. And we're going to have a downturn. And a lot of these VCs who have started firms, and by the way, everyone in this room knows it's really hard to break into venture capital. So a lot of them came like the number 3 at Facebook or the number 4 at Salesforce, and they went in and they raised capital and put money out there. And just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you're good at investing. And I do think that there is a serious talent for having a nose for what's good, and then also some understanding how you navigate that long road to whatever it may be.
I'm not sure I agree that there's too much venture capital out there. I mean, look, if you're an entrepreneur, then there's never enough venture capital out there. And entrepreneurs are the raw material of the venture capital business. That's what we invest in. So anything that's good for entrepreneurs is good for the venture capital business. So I think we could have even more capital in the venture capital business. I would like there to be more seed capital. I'd like there to be more early stage capital. And I don't think there's enough of it yet.
Hi, Diane Henry with Rogue Capital Collective. Hello again. My question is as follows. So what I've heard a lot from venture capitalists is that what it takes to get the job is very different from what it takes to do the job. And I'll include in that category raising funds. And so my question to you is, what advice do you have for people outside from demographic sort of preferred categories and not preferred categories in terms of how capital is distributed? What advice would you give for people who don't have the HBS or the Stanford or the sort of signifiers, the early employees at large companies, who have other assets that might be important to being a good investor, that have nothing to do with the things that people screen for in order to sort of find defensible choices as far as the deployment of capital, is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you've done that, which is become an angel investor and show people what you can do and what your thesis is and what your success is with the companies that you've chosen. I also think that if you don't have the capital, You know, you can insert yourself into these businesses with your provenance and with your knowledge to get on boards and help these companies and get involved in the ones that you've chosen, so that you start to build this portfolio and show that you have a good nose for this business. And, you know, and start small. I do think that there's checks out there from family offices that want to back different investors with small funds. And that's not necessarily coming from the large institutional investors that are LPs.
What we always look for in people to bring into our firm as investors is people who reference well with entrepreneurs, and that's basically what we want. And so I think your point is that maybe that's what entrepreneurs want, but the people who invest in venture capitalists don't realize that that's what they want. But I think over time, that's where performance will accrue to. And so my advice with people all the time is spend time with entrepreneurs, help them succeed, and then you can succeed on their backs. I mean, I don't mean that like in a bad way, but that's where you have to invest.
I agree.
Hey, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
No? Rashawn Williams, General Partner at the All-Star Fund. Thank you for the insight. Aaron asked a great question that I just wanted to get you guys to elaborate on. He mentioned top 20 venture capitalists being more inclusive to micro VCs and other VCs in terms of getting in deals. And I think that's the most important question I've heard all day, because as early stage, small, minority-owned VC firms expand, the only way for them to really win is to also get into the deals that the top 20 venture capital firms are then leading. Because even the minority-owned businesses all want their rounds led by the top 20 VCs. So 2 questions about that. I see it on both sides. The first side is my first fund, we co-invested with a top 5 VC firm 70 times. And all they did was send a text message and email and got us into every single transaction. And you mentioned that the onus is more so on the founders these days, but I've actually seen from my experience that when the lead investor sends a message to the founder who's really leaning on him, they let us in that round for our little 250 when the lead put in 5. But then on the other hand, I've seen a lead that after we invested has blocked us out of deals by saying stuff like actually having the right to veto or approve any other investor that comes into the round. They look at committed capital as the main source of eliminating us. And they also do things like, hey, let me interview the VC, and if they can bring some strategic value, we'll let them in. So we see them block us out because of the size of our funds. They're like, how much are they going to commit to future rounds? But we also see they have the ability to let us in. So just curious if you could elaborate a little bit on how micro VCs and emerging managers can get in this deal flow, because it's imperative in order for us to get the type of gains which helps us raise the next funds and then eventually attract the institutional investors.
There are people in Silicon Valley who will dictate to an entrepreneur who's going to get into their round. Those are the people who are texting the entrepreneur saying, put these guys on your cap table. I'm not that person. I'm never going to do that. I'm going to let the entrepreneur decide who wants to get in the round, and I'm never going to block anybody from it. So I just do business differently than the people you've been doing business with.
All right. Well, it seems like we're out of time. I just want to thank Fred and Joanne for this talk. It was really fun. I hope everybody learned something here.